Okay. So yesterday we began speaking about food that was prepared by a non-Jew and different types of decrees that the rabbis instituted regarding different types of foods. And we started by speaking about bread. And just to summarize, we spoke about how if it is bread that was baked by a baker, then one can be lenient, as opposed to if it's homemade bread baked by a non-Jew, then only under extreme circumstances can one be lenient. We spoke about as long as the Jew adds to the flame, that already means it's Jewish involvement. We spoke about Ezekiel bread not being a problem since it's not made with grain. We spoke about bread with toppings being a problem because then that's already like a food that we'll learn about today. And finally, if it's owned by a Jew and there's a non-Jew that's actually baking it, then that's also a problem. Let's now move on to cooked foods. So let's start with the criteria. In other words, which foods have to be cooked by a Jew and which foods can also be cooked by a non-Jew? So here are the criteria. If a non-Jew cooked or roasted something which cannot be eaten in its raw state and is fit to be served on the table of kings as a relish or dessert, it is forbidden as bishul akum. So any food that A, cannot be eaten raw, and B, is a food that's fit to be served on a king's table, meaning it's a more honorable type of food, has to be cooked by a Jew. Even if it was cooked with a Jew's utensils, meaning let's say in a kosher kitchen in the house of a Jew. However, the flip side to that, something which is edible in its raw state, or if it's food that is not held in esteem and would not be served on the table of a king, it is not forbidden as food cooked by a non-Jew. You need not be concerned about the utensils of a non-Jew because it is assumed that most utensils were not used within the past 24 hours. Let's leave that last part for now because it's not so relevant to us in today's day and age. But what we're saying over here in summary is if you, this is quite relevant. It basically has to do with what the Beis Din would be able to certify for us. What would be able to have a Beis Din stamp? So for example, Simba potato chips. Simba potato chips is a snack. It's a chip. Since it's a chip, therefore it wouldn't be served on the king's table. And therefore, even though in the Simba factory there aren't Jews turning on the ovens, it has a Beis Din stamp, meaning it's kosher. Same would go with most chips or any types of chips. Some people say with regards to potato chips that maybe there's more what to talk about because it's being made with potatoes and potatoes are honorable on a king's table. But the general consensus is that since it is being made as a snack, it is okay if the oven was not turned on by a Jew. That would be an example of the second example of the second thing. An example of the first would be if a company makes the cooked apples. So that could be honorable. You could have a nice dessert. You could serve some cooked apples. That could be a delicacy. But since apples are also able to be eaten raw, that's not a problem. This institution of the sages is only relevant, only applies if A, it's a food that cannot be eaten raw, and B, it's a food that can go on the king's table. That was number 6. Now, as far as number 7 and 8, when a non-Jewish maid works in a Jewish home and does the cooking for the Jewish household, it is customary to be lenient and to eat the food because it is impossible that some member of the household will not stoke the fire. Obviously, that is not relevant today. Today, it is unlikely that you are in the kitchen unless you are in the kitchen with our big homes and so many things that are going on. So there are also other reasons for that leniency as far as whether, I'm not going to get into it now, as far as the concerns of intermarriage being less if it's within the Jewish home. But the bottom line is that we don't make exception, and therefore staff in the kitchen would need to be told that they cannot put the food on the fire or more simply, they cannot turn the fire on. Once you've turned the fire on, then they would be able to put the pot on the fire. However, if she made the maid cooks only for herself, it is unlikely that a Jew would stoke the fire, and it is possible that even stoking would be of no avail, for this is worse than if she cooks for a Jew. Therefore, if she cooks food which is subject to the rules of food cooked by a non-Jew, then not only is the food forbidden, but even the utensils are forbidden for use in cooking. They would need to be kashered. If they were used inadvertently, you need to ask her up, maybe not. So in summary, for 8 and 9, you need to ensure that you are somewhat on top of your kitchen, making sure that you are turning on the fires. And if your pot was used, even if it's only for kosher food and on a kosher stove, by your staff for themselves without you turning on the fire, then that pot may very well need to be kashered, re-koshered. Even though it's only kosher ingredients were used, the moment it was used for food which ultimately became not kosher because they weren't cooked by a Jew, then that pot may very well need to be kashered. Okay, here's an interesting scenario. What happens if on Shabbos somebody was sick and desperately needed food on Shabbos itself? In such a situation, a non-Jew would be allowed to cook food for that person that is sick. However, the reason they were able to cook for him is because a Jew can't cook for him because it's Shabbos. Or let's say his life is not in danger, or even if it is, you'd rather have a non-Jew cook the food, which is a rabbinic prohibition, than have a Jew cook the food for him, which is a scriptural prohibition. However, that said, that food would only work for him and would not be kosher for anybody else to eat, even after Shabbos, even for that sick person, once other food is available. So it's a kind of a special dispensation on Shabbos. If somebody who is sick needs food, then the non-Jew would be able to cook it for him. But once Shabbos was over, then that food would revert to would become non-kosher, because at that point, the decree of the rabbis falls into place, and because at this point you could make other foods. The utensils, however, would not need to be kosher. They could be used after 24 hours, since this was done in a kosher way, because that was the right thing to do at the time. So that's an interesting scenario. There's a scenario where you should have food cooked by a non-Jew, and that would be if somebody is sick and needs the food on Shabbos. However, that food would only remain kosher for the duration of Shabbos for that person. After Shabbos, it would return to being food of a non-Jew and would not be kosher for consumption. Okay, what about somebody who says, I like raw eggs? Okay, I don't know if you've ever heard that there was an old thing about chazanim, that in order to have some good chazanis, they would gargle a raw egg. Although I don't even know if that's what we're talking about, because that would be more for medicinal purpose. But even if a person said he likes to eat raw eggs, then he might say, if so, it's okay if a non-Jew cooks the egg for me, because it can also be eaten in a raw state. Another modern application for this today might be fish. Today, there's something called sushi, where they put in fish that was never cooked. It's raw fish, and people are eating it. So you might deduct from that if fish is now being eaten raw, it is okay if it was cooked by a non-Jew, because the principle is that only food that cannot be eaten raw may not be cooked by a non-Jew. But since this food can be eaten raw, therefore it can be cooked by a non-Jew. But he says not so with regards to a raw egg. Why? Since it is only eaten in this manner in unusual circumstances. So you might be able to say the same regarding fish. Nobody's going to just eat plain raw fish. It's only in a specific context of it being wrapped up in a sushi. So yeah, but the bottom line I'm not 100% sure on, but I do believe that fish is considered generally a food that is not eaten raw, just like these raw eggs. And therefore, if it was cooked by a non-Jew, it would be forbidden. This reading applies to similar types of foods. More on the subject, fruits not fully tree ripened and which are eaten raw only in unusual circumstances when they are sugar-coated by chefs are forbidden as foods cooked by a non-Jew. So although once that same very mini peach will fully ripen, it will be able to be eaten raw. Since at this point, it cannot be eaten raw, therefore it would fall into the category of foods that can only be eaten cooked. And therefore, if it was done by a non-Jew, then it would be not kosher. Okay, moving on. So that was as far as cooked foods. I hear from one of the participants that there are people that do eat raw fish even outside of salmon. So I guess we'd have to revert back to the big halachic authorities whether a change in halacha has occurred in light of the change of people's eating habits. Okay, so drinks. So there was also, to avoid intermarriage, the rabbis also forbade drinking with non-Jews in a way that it could lead to intermarriage. However, in most scenarios today, this is not a problem. However, there are situations where it would be problematic. Let's see what the Kitzur says about that. It is permitted to drink beer made from grains or honey, even when sold in the houses of a non-Jew, and it is not considered food cooked by a non-Jew because the grain is neutralized in the water. So it's not considered like a cooked food, and this is different. Even if they're heating it up, it's a drink. It's not considered an honorable food. However, it is necessary to investigate whether or not it was fortified with wine sediments. Obviously, if there's any residue of wine, then that would be a problem. In localities where Jews are careless and lax in regard to drinking non-Jewish wine, a conscientious Jew should refrain from drinking even beer, even if it's kosher, because one can lead to the other. In regard to drinking coffee without milk, or with milk, it would be forbidden because the milk needs to be supervised by a Jew. We'll learn more about milk, though, in greater detail in a moment. So drinking coffee, chocolate, or tea made by a non-Jew, he says a conscientious Jew should refrain from drinking them. There are authorities, however, who permit drinking them occasionally, but as a regular practice, it is forbidden. So actually, I haven't gone back to my notes on this particular halacha. One of the institutions of the sages, as I mentioned, was regarding drinking. And in most scenarios today, this is allowed, but there can be situations when this would be forbidden. So here's a big one, and that's milk. It's a big one because there is a lot of rabbinic response and discussion on this one. And once I researched it, and there were literally pages and pages from all different rabbis over the last, I would say, couple of 100 years regarding milk. So what the Talmud says, the original law was that milk that was milked by a non-Jew without Jewish supervision is forbidden. And it's even forbidden to make cheese from it. Okay, so the rabbi said that a Jew has to be present by the milking. Why? So the Gemara discusses different reasons. The main reason the Gemara gives is because there was a concern that perhaps a little bit of other milk would get mixed into this milk. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Other milk is usually a different color, and you'd see. The Gemara says, no, it might be a really small amount of milk, and you wouldn't be able to see it. And therefore, if a Jew is not present when the milk is being milked, then the milk is not kosher. The Gemara asks, what about if you take the milk and you make it into cheese? And the Gemara says that only cow's milk or kosher milk will become cheese. If you were to use pig milk or other types of milk, they will not become cheese, at least back then in the times of the Gemara. So you could kind of do an experiment, do a scientific experiment, turn it into cheese, and then you'll see if it is all kosher milk or not. The Gemara says, no, there's a little bit of drops that sometimes get caught inside of the cracks of the cheese. And it might be that those little drops are actually non-kosher, and that would be a problem. Now, the bottom line is that once the rabbis instituted this prohibition, then that's the bottom line. Any milk needs to be supervised. Any milking needs to be supervised by a Jew, which means that from the moment that the cow is milked, there would need to be a mashgiach. There will need to be a mashgiach present to watch the milking until it's sealed. And once it's sealed, he'll put his added seal, or he'll write down the number of that individual seal. And then when it is brought to the bottling company, there'll need to be a mashgiach there that watches once that seal is broken until it's sealed into a bottle. So in order to have kosher milk, really there is an expense involved of having a mashgiach on the farm and having a mashgiach at the bottling company to make sure that it is constantly, as long as it's not sealed, it's under Jewish supervision. Now, it is worth mentioning that there is a large halachic authority, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said that today, although milk that is milked by without being under Jewish supervision is not kosher, so you need witnesses. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein ruled that government authorities are considered as if there is a Jew present. It is considered like a Jewish virtual witness. There's also a whole discussion about cameras. And that was a big innovative approach. And not everybody agreed with that, because after all, the Gemara says a Jew needs to be present, and there isn't a Jew present. But Rabbi Moshe ruled that having government sanctions and government sanctions where the government will enforce fines if any other milk was mixed in, that's equivalent to a Jew being present. So he didn't say that milk no longer needs to be milked in the presence of a Jew. That he never said. What he did say was, in a place where there are government sanctions, where it is illegal, then those government sanctions will be considered like a Jew. So you have this virtual Jew. The government now is called the Jew, and therefore the milk is being milked in the presence of a Jew. It's based actually on this responsa that in many communities around the world today, such milk is drinking, such as even a bottle of Woolworths milk today in Johannesburg. If you buy a bottle of Woolworths milk and there is a based in step, it means that it does not mean that the milk was milked in the presence of a physical Jew. It just means that the based in ensured that all the facilities are being done everything is being done in a kosher way, and they are relying on this responsa of Reb Moshe. So that is as far as today. Now, obviously, this became the reason for Reb Moshe's responsa was because with industrialized revolution, things are being shipped from far places. Once upon a time, every guy got milk from his local farmers. So there was always a cow in sight. You could kind of go to your nearest cow and ask for a cup of milk. But today, where that's no longer so possible to just get milk from the farm, so it became difficult to send off a mashgiach to the farm and have him live on the farm. And that's how we came up with the leniency. But that said, others asked that what about the fact that mashgiach going off to the farm is not going to be able to be part of the Jewish community because he's out on the farms by himself. He might not even be able to daven properly. And to that, it was clear that certainly that's not a problem because he is serving the community. It's a critical need. So certainly all would agree, or at least I believe that Reb Moshe, or not just I believe, Reb Moshe Feinstein himself wrote in letters to for example, the Toronto community that any Jewish institutions or the yeshivas certainly should rather not rely on that leniency and get milk that says that it is Chalav Yisrael. However, that leniency is in place and is relied upon by many. So initially, a Jew must be present when the milking is begun and see that the milking pail is clean. You can see this was written over 100 years ago, this kitzur. It is also customary to refrain from milking into a pail generally used for non-kosher by a non-Jew for milking, meaning you should have exclusive machinery. Non-Jewish maids that milk the cows, the Jews' cows on the premises of a Jew or in their own barn, if it is situated so that a house of a non-Jew does not obstruct the milking of the view of the milking, and there is no danger of their drawing milk from an unclean animal, it is permitted even initially to let them do the milking. So this is the Gemara says, what happens if the Jew, for example, cannot see when he's sitting, but when he stands up, he'll be able to see? Well, the Gemara discusses, what about if it's on the Jewish farm? So as long as at any given moment, you will be able to see exactly what's going on, that's fine. Even if you're not watching the whole time, as long as you are able to watch at any given time, then that would consider the milk under kosher supervision. But if a non-Jewish house obstructs the view, it is necessary to have Jewish supervision. Even a minor, a male or female, over 9 years old is sufficient for this purpose. Thank you so much for joining us, and wishing you a wonderful Shabbos. And please God, tomorrow we will conclude this section of foods of a non-Jew and be moving on to, now that we've done getting our food ready for consumption, we will begin to see how a Jew eats his food.